Hello and welcome to everyone out there in the Actual Tech Media audience. Thanks so much for joining us. We've got a great presentation and discussion lined up for you here today on the webinar. The topic is 2023 ransomware trends, talking about the new report released from Veeam, where they cover lessons learned from 1,200 victims of cyber attacks. This is a great opportunity for anyone out there who wants to prevent a cyber attack happening at your company. And, if you are hit by chance, how to rapidly recover. This event, of course, is presented in partnership thanks to our friends over at Veeam. Now, before we get started, there's just a few things that you should know about the webinar today. My name is David Davis, and I'll be serving as the host. Of course, we always want these events here to be educational, and we encourage your questions. Many of you have already said hello and good afternoon, and we love to hear that, but we also want your technical questions. We even have a best question prize to help further encourage some of those questions. I'll talk more about that here in just a moment. But first, I want to point out to you the resources that are there in the Handouts tab. You'll find a link to the 2023 Ransomware Trends report right there at the top. You can click on that, fill out a quick form right there, just a few fields, and you'll get the report that we'll be discussing on the webinar today. There's also a link to the Ransomware Prevention Kit. This is a lot of great resources here packed into a single kit to help you prevent ransomware. And then, of course, you'll find a number of other resources there in the Handouts tab as well. I want to point out the questions tab to you there. Many of you have said hello, but that is the place where you post your technical questions during the discussion. So keep those questions coming. And then finally, at the end of the webinar, I'll be announcing the winner of our Amazon $250 gift card. If you're watching this webinar recorded, of course, that drawing would have already occurred. The prize terms and conditions can be found there in the Handouts tab. And then, as I mentioned, we also have our best question prize. This is for an additional Amazon $50 gift card. Prize winners will be selected and contacted after the event, and you must still meet the Actual Tech Media prize policy. All right, with that housekeeping information out of the way, it's now time to bring in today's expert presenters. I'm excited to welcome Chris Hoff, Security Marketing Manager at Veeam, and he'll be hosting Jason Buffington, who's the Vice President of Market Strategy for Veeam. Chris and Jason, it's great to have you both on. I'll hand it off to you. Take it away.
Everybody to this webinar on the Ransomware Trends Report for 2023. Lessons learned from 1,200 victims and nearly 3,000 cyber attacks. My name is Chris Hoff. I'm Product Marketing Manager here at Veeam for security. Today, I'm joined by Jason Buffington, our VP of Market Strategy from our Office of the CTO. Jason, welcome. Introduce yourself.
Chris, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you today. It's always a fun conversation to talk about ransomware. So, just to give everybody a little bit of context, take us through how we got to producing this report for the second year.
Sure. So one of the functions that I do for the Office of CTO is I help co-lead a lot of our industry independent research. So this is not Veeam customers. This was not us who ran the survey. We use third-party industry analyst firms and research bureaus. We tell them the kinds of organizations, the kinds of personas that we would like to have surveyed. They go off and do the survey work. And I think that's especially important when we talk about something like ransomware. This is not representative necessarily of Veeam customers along the way. So in this case, what we really wanted to understand, there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of FUD out there around ransomware and cyber events. I know that this is an area that's important to you as well. But what we asked the research firm to go and do was find 1,200 organizations, all of whom had suffered at least one ransomware attack in the preceding 12 months. And one of the things is a lot of times folks aren't really that eager to say, hey, let me tell you how bad it was. Right, and so this was an anonymous survey. All their information is anonymized out so that no one's going to go and sell them anything or anything like that. But really, just to get 1,200 real lessons learned. Now, two other things that we wanted to make sure were design goals for this. You can see the diagrams on the chart. One is there's a lot of different personas within any given organization that can affect both the prevention or the remediation from a cyber event. And so we wanted to survey those 4 different types of personas to really kind of understand, do they agree on how these strategies and implementations should be aligned? And so you can see here, we've got about 20%-ish, about a fifth that are executive minded, usually the CISO or someone else responsible. About a fifth of the people that we normally talk to, which are the backup administrators. About a fifth are IT operations. Those are the folks that usually get the first call. And then a little over a third, almost a 2/5 that are security professionals, right? These are your people, Chris, along the way. The other thing that was important for us to look at was we really want to make sure that, certainly ransomware is not only a global problem, but it affects organizations of all sizes. And so really getting the perspectives of small and mid-sized orgs, commercial size orgs, enterprise and large enterprise, really just trying to understand how bad, how often, what did they do prior, what did they learn, those kind of things, so that Veeam can honestly make better products, and so the folks listening to calls like this one can understand new conversations to have with your peers, with your management, et cetera. So really looking forward to sharing some of the insights today.
And this didn't just pop up. I mean, you guys do a lot of research, and it's some pretty fantastic research. It's larger, I think, than some of the dedicated research firms that are out there. But you mentioned our 1,200 survey participants. Yep. They just didn't come out of nowhere. I mean, they came from an interesting place, which is also attributed to your data protection trends report that Veeam does every year, where we saw 85% of organizations from that report suffered at least one ransomware attack. And
yeah, so every year for the last several, and I think this is like year 7 or year 8. I actually used to author it back when I was an analyst out at one of those research firms for Veeam once upon a time. I've been with Veeam now for about 5.5 years now, but the data protection report is the largest of its kind. So last year, 4,200 responses. That's right, over 4,000, over 28 countries around the world, organizations of all sizes. And that's kind of a macro report, right? That's the entire trend of what are you looking for? What are you coming from? What are your SLAs? It also lets us ask a few questions about cloud, a few questions about containers, and in this case, also a few questions about cyber events. And so in the 2023 Data Protection Trends Report, one of the questions that was asked was how many ransomware attacks has the organization suffered? And you can see the curve here. Obviously the green on the left is what we would hope to see. 15%, or maybe I should say only 15% of organizations said they did not suffer. Now let's take a look at that for a second, because Chris, in fact, you were the one who taught me that based on those long gestation rates that we often see in organizations, even that 15% is probably pretty optimistic. It's probably even less than that.
It probably is. I mean, there's the dwell time, which depending on who you're talking to can be anywhere from a month to 6 months these days. And let's face it, there's plenty of ways to obfuscate that attack and make sure that you can't find out that you're actually being attacked. What I do find interesting about this is not surprising, that 85% number from Data Protection Trends Report was up from 76% last year. So what is that? That's a 7-ish% increase.
Yeah. So, or depending on how you think about it, 50%, or it's gonna be 33% less people said that going from 76 down to 15, or excuse me, from 24 down to 15. So a third of the people that last year said they did not get hit now are in the other column. So it's as an industry, I think we're going the wrong direction on that. There's another aspect to this other than just the losing percentage of folks that say they had not been hit in the last year. Let's go ahead and mute out those middle columns for a second, because take a look at the number of folks that actually said they got hit 4 or more times, right? So think about that. You're in a C-level boardroom meeting, and during your quarterly business review, you're saying, well, this is what this quarter's revenue looks like. This is what next quarter's projections look like. And oh, by the way, here's the results of this quarter's cyber attack, right? That is what I would refer to as a resume generating event, right there. But the reality is, what do we got? 11 plus 5, 16 plus 1, 17. So actually, and if for folks writing this down, more organizations got hit quarterly by a ransomware attack than organizations believe they did not get hit at all. I'm going to say that again in case you're taking notes. More organizations got hit quarterly in some way. Maybe not the entire org, maybe not the entire division, whatever, but more folks got hit quarterly by some kind of a cyber attack than the number of organizations that believe they did not get hit at all. And that kind of tells us, wow, this is such a big problem. It's not just the hype. It's not just the press. We should go and do a specific project and learn, what did they learn as part of that experience. That's why we did this project.
And one of the other interesting things that we've learned from this project is about alignment for responding to these attacks. And talk about this, because this is something that I've honestly found pretty surprising.
Yeah, so a lot of organizations will talk about how cyber resiliency, remediation from a cataclysmic event like cyber is not that different in some ways from a strategy perspective versus recovering from a flood that wipes out an entire data center, or a fire, or an earthquake, or a tornado, or any other kind of natural disaster along the way. So while I like the fact that that organizations are thinking holistically about how do they ensure cyber resiliency so that the business continues to have access to data, I love that. Great for one strategy. There's always some deviations. But the fact that the teams that were surveyed aren't aligned, I find to be really, really problematic. And again, this was one of the design goals, was to measure how aligned are those 4 different personas. So what you're looking on the left is the aggregate of all the responses. And unfortunately, between the red and the orange, about 60% of organizations believe that there's not good alignment between the cybersecurity team, let's call them prevention, and the IT backup team, let's call them remediation, along the way. 60% believe either significant improvement in alignment or a complete overhaul is required. But what I think was even more telling is it's the same question on the right-hand side. We just cut it by those 4 personas, but take a look at that peak in the orange under the backup admin, right? The team most likely responsible for being brought in as part of remediation is the team least satisfied with the integration or the alignment between the orgs, right? And they're the ones you're going to call when everything goes bad. Second only to them in sentiment is the, next up is IT operations. They get the call, then prevention in the SecOps. And honestly, I think the other extreme that's interesting is that big swing over in the CISO category. Arguably, Chris, you could almost say that maybe too many executives might be naive to how dysfunctional perhaps some of these teams are.
It's really interesting to see that, and it's definitely one of those things where the closer you are to the problem, the
Yep.
more clearly I would say that you see it.
That's a great read. Yep.
It's one of those things that a lot of organizations. I remember back in the day. I remember when, I'm getting old, but we would have tabletop exercises, and you just check the box. Yes, the backup team will recover the data. Done. And they usually weren't even in the room for those exercises. I will say that more and more companies that I talk to, they are pulling those backup teams into those tabletop exercises specifically for these alignment issues, and making them part of that solution. And that's got its challenges too, because obviously you have to prove that you can recover. But honestly, I think that's a good problem to have, given the costs associated with cyber threats these days.
Yeah, so let's double down on that one more second. Go back for me just for a second, because I think one of the things that you bring up is anytime in any kind of disaster preparedness, the more that you test, right? Both the people and the technologies and processes. The more you test, the more that you ought to be finding opportunities to improve, right? So when you're testing for things like cyber or any other kind of disaster for that matter, you're actually looking for the red X's. You're not looking for green check marks. Green check marks just make the auditor happy. You're looking for the red X's for where do we need to improve. And if one of the areas that you identify during the exercise is, hey, these teams aren't talking often enough, right? That's actually a good thing, because now that you've identified that, you can start to work on that. And my guess is the teams that are going through those exercises, like you say, and I'm a huge fan of those, we have a few partners that do that today. Those are the folks that are actually scoring in the gray, maybe in the green, saying, no, we're getting better, right? So we've identified the problem, we started to move down that path. But if you're not doing those exercises, you probably are definitely scoring in the orange, if not the red. That's kind of the point of testing. For
sure. And we all know that from a backup perspective, having a good backup is going to be part of that. So talk about a little bit about what we found here when we dug into those conversations.
Sure. So one of the things that we wanted, again, this always goes back to it's the people and the process that are going to matter. It's not necessarily the tech on its own. And so one of the questions was, prior to the incident, remember, everyone had to have suffered at least one in the last 12 months. Did you have a team? Did they have a plan? Right? So take a look at the bottom two options. Of the 1,200 organizations that got hit last year, only 2% of them did not have a team pre-identified. And Chris, I'm hoping you're going to back me on this, but the time to identify, okay, who's going to be involved when everything goes bad, is not after everything's gone bad, right? So I love the fact that only 2% did not have a team. Of the 98% that had a team, only 3% did not have a plan, right? So we can take off those 5% of folks, but of the other 95% of organizations, they had a team, they had a plan. And so then the question was, okay, what's in your plan? And while it does appear a little self-serving, I think it's really powerful that the top two things in the plan, just like you said, Chris, the top two things in the plan are the assumption or the assurance, depending on if you're an optimist or pessimist, the assurance that you do have copies of data, they are confirmed to be clean, they are verifiable, recoverable, and they're backed up frequently enough, because we all know that as part of a remediation exercise, you're going to have to roll back. You can't count on the most current copy of anything. So are you protecting frequently? Are you verifying those copies are recoverable, and that you have a means to ensure the data is clean? Are actually those attributes are the top two things in most incident response teams' playbooks. And I think they got it right.
I totally agree, and I always had this memory. CISO that I knew a few years ago, actually more than a few years ago now, used to say that the worst time to hear somebody say "I think" is in the middle of a crisis. So having that plan first is definitely a good thing. What's interesting though is from our friends over at IDC, they had a report that I think came out end of last year, that said most organizations only test their backups and update their backup plans once a year. Yep. And they specifically called out the fact that it's a manual process. It takes too much time. It's too hard, and they've just got more important things to go on. And from a best practices perspective, it really calls out the need for automation anywhere that you can go, right? We hear about automation and security with automation orchestration tools, right? SOAR, but in the backup world, being able to automatically build that DR plan and be able to make sure that your backups are tested, so that during those tabletop exercises, we can confidently say, yes, we can recover this data and prove it, is going to take us a long way to being part of the folks who are able to recover without paying a ransom. Now,
So I love the findings on that. I've been with Veeam now, as I mentioned, for about 5.5 years. My last gig before Veeam, I was an industry analyst, kind of like your friends over at IDC and Forrester. I actually ran a similar survey before I joined Veeam, and one of the things I thought was really interesting was you're right. On average, organizations were typically testing traditional DR about usually I had numbers of around 10 and a half months. So there's a few of them that were testing every 6, but most of them were testing annually. And when you do the qualitative interviews and ask why, it's so important. Why are you only doing it? It's because it's hard, right? It's very labor intensive. If you're not using good sandboxing, it can be really disruptive because you can't bring up 2 servers with the same name on the same wire. You want the users to be able to test, but you can't let the servers overlap. I mean, there's a lot of things that make that process hard. The other thing is that when we did those interviews on that was in many cases, they were not testing rigorously. So what happened is they were testing, hey, does the server power up? Okay, I got a green light, must be good. And then they wonder why during the actual crisis, it couldn't begin servicing users again. And so it was not bearing fruit. And so it became deprioritized, blah, blah, blah. And so to your point, when we tested what were the levers that affected frequency of testing, the 2 levers that actually were most effective with an A in changing the frequency of protection, 1, orchestrated workflow, because you got rid of all the minutia that was so labor intensive and could programatize that in. And then secondly, having secondary infrastructure on demand. And so when this was 6 years ago, so DRaaS was still very much in its new state. But the idea of being able to say, okay, I can spin up secondary hardware when I need it long enough to play and validate and then shut it back down. For organizations that embrace those 2 attributes, secondary infrastructure on demand and orchestrated workflow, the average amount of time they had between tests of at least some level of component level failover went from 9 months to 5 weeks because it wasn't disruptive, because it could be automated, it could be scheduled. And as we talked about before, the more that you test, the more that you'll identify things that can be improved so that when you actually need it, it actually will fail over. But that was the results of some DR frequency testing a while back. I will point out that in DPR, for those organizations that are using cloud infrastructure, they're now reporting on an average of every 5 months. So we're at least in that half-year curve, and hopefully the industry continues to get better.
That's a great point, and it's good to hear. It's good to hear the number of organizations that are continuing to improve their testing capabilities is going up, because it's going to be important the more ransomware evolves. But to the point of the evolution, and switching gears a little bit, one of the interesting statistics that you found in this year's trends report is the amount of data that was encrypted. Can tell us about this a little bit?
Yeah, so this is pretty heartbreaking. So I know there's a lot of different percentage signs on this chart. So let me just walk it to you. So the respondent was actually given the question of what percentage of the organization's production data do you estimate the ransomware attack successfully affected, encrypted, shredded, whatever you want to call it as a term. And they were given, 5 options: 0 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60 to 80 to 100. There's 2 things to kind of be thinking about here. One of them is look at that boundary condition, that upper left-hand corner, where 81 to 100%. So that's basically everything, right? 14%. So 1 in 7 organizations said they basically got everything. Imagine it's like this. Imagine when you go through a site that a tornado has gone through, and where you used to have a home, you now have a cement slab and a few studs poking out of it. That's what we mean by everything, right? It is down to the studs. There is almost nothing left. Now, that is the dire case. The average case is just under half, right? 45%. And let's just pare it down. Let's be a little bit more conservative. Let's call it 40%. And so the way I think about this, 2 out of 5 hard drives, 2 out of 5 applications, 2 out of 5 databases, 2 out of 5 shared folders. For folks on the phone, I always try to make this a little bit more personal. I'm a father of 3, got a grandbaby on the way. 2 out of 5 of your family photos, right? Can't go back and take them again, right? 2 out of 5 of your grandparents' kids' photos, right? They're not here anymore. 2 out of 5 of whatever you hold precious has just been shredded. And that is the average aftermath of a cyber event.
And it gets a little bit scarier when we start talking about how we actually recover from this, because you asked about paying the ransom, and it's surprising to me the number of organizations that did actually pay the ransom. And there is a statistic, I believe, in the full report that talks about the number of companies who had a policy to say that they didn't pay the ransom, but actually did.
Right.
You know, it's pretty shocking.
Yeah, so, and by the way, the QR code should be on the top of almost all of the slides on here, and that's going to take you right to the full download of the report. And yeah, one of the stats that's not in today's session actually talked about, did you have a policy, either a political policy, right? Your country says don't pay, or an internal policy. The board says we will not, succumb to criminals, right? And that sounds lovely until all your systems are down and you no longer are producing revenue. And the short math is roughly about 40% of organizations have a we will pay, 40% had a we won't pay, and about 20% said we have no policy, we'll decide at game time, which, by the way, I think is the worst possible scenario, right? Because no good choices happen at game time. It's like, nothing good ever happens after 2 a.m. It's just a bad time to be making decisions. But yeah, so a significant percentage of folks that did actually have a no pay policy still paid. But there's two other things in the nuance of this data that I would focus on. And in fact, for the folks at home, especially if you're multitasking during this webinar, take a screenshot of this one, please. Because to me, Chris, this epitomizes the entire problem of cyber attacks within our industry in 2023. So let me unpack what I mean by that. First of all, 80% of the victims last year paid, right? So 59 in the orange, 21 in the red, 80% of organizations did pay the ransom. Okay, that's the reason why these bad actors are in business, is because the vast majority of people will pay. But comparing the red to the orange, 1 in 4 organizations that paid the ransom still could not recover, right? That's the red versus the orange. 1 in 4 that paid. So you can imagine you're down, all your systems are shredded, you somehow figure out how to learn how to do Bitcoin, you throw that out, you don't even get the magic wand, it just doesn't work. You're not up. So that's problem point number 1. 1 in 4 that paid still could not recover. There's a few other things that are in here as well. Let's talk about each of the scenarios. One of them is 4% of organizations weren't even asked for a ransom. This was not a ransom at that point. It was arson. I just want to do you harm, right? They weren't even the pretense of selling you hope. And then we'll talk about the green wedge in a second. But Chris, 1 in 4 paid but couldn't get it back. It's almost like those ransomware folks don't have good QA on their decryptor. What's with that?
Well, they are focused on separating you from your money, not necessarily getting your data back, right? So what is going to give them the best ROI is being able to quickly encrypt or even destroy, or we're seeing more and more organizations just outright stealing the data. They have no real business reason to give your data back after you've paid.
It's fair read. Now here's the other side. Here's the small glimmer of hope. And by small glimmer, I mean 1 out of 6 organizations. That green wedge in the upper left-hand corner, 1 out of 6 organizations, 16%, actually said, no, we did not pay. We were able to recover. And honestly, if I was in charge of Veeam's marketing organization, that would be my tagline for the company for 2023. Our goal in life ought to be, and actually not even just Veeam, the whole backup industry, the goal in life ought to be that we help the other 84% of organizations be able to say, no, we did not pay, we recovered our own data instead. And so certainly from a what's the goal, that should be the goal. But Chris, the other thing which this kind of explains about where the industry is headed, compare the red wedge versus the green wedge. More organizations paid but could not recover than the number of organizations that could recover without paying. That is the problem statement that we're looking at for 2023.
I completely agree, and to that point, and to my earlier point about it being an ROI calculation, we saw that at least 93% of cyber attacks targeted backup repositories. So it's no wonder that folks are losing so much data. And from my perspective, that might as well be 100%. So it's essentially a standard operating procedure, which frankly makes sense when you put it into the return on investment. The bad guys are going to do everything they possibly can to maximize their profit and stop you from having any other choice than paying that ransom.
Yeah, let me paint a picture on that, and for the folks at home that are watching this, let's pretend for a second that Chris throws me off the side of a boat in the middle of the ocean. Now, Chris would then like to sell me a life preserver. He'd like to sell me the ability to live, right? Now, the only reason I'm not going to buy that life preserver is if I can A, swim back to the boat myself, or B, I can find something else that's floating nearby so that I can save myself, right? So if I have two options to save myself, what Chris is doing, or the bad actor in this case, sorry, buddy, is basically eliminating my ability to save myself so that I'll have no choice but to then buy the safety, right? To buy the rescue. And that's really what's happening here is in at least 93%. The reason we say that is because 7% of respondents said that the bad actor did not attempt to impact the backups. Now, unless you're doing either network tracing or you're running system logs on all the admin logs, it's very hard for you to actually wholly say, no, I promise the bad actor didn't even try to touch. So in at least 93% or more of cases, it was standard operating procedure for the bad actor to eliminate the ability for the organization to save themselves, right? So that you would buy their life preserver, you would buy their rescue. And unfortunately, not only is it standard operating procedure in 93+% of cases, the bad actor was successful in 3 out of 4 cases. In 75% of the time, that's the red and the orange, they were able to reduce your ability to save yourself. And honestly, Chris, I don't think it's that unreasonable that 18% of the time in this chart, the backup repositories were unscathed. And on that last chart, we saw 16% of folks were able to recover their own data, right? I think those two things are together, because if you don't have survivable repositories, you have no other choice. You will be paying that ransom or you will be out of business. Amen.
Absolutely, and it really comes down to some best practices, right? I mean, we've talked about immutability and multi-layered immutability for years now, but it's more than just having immutable storage, right? There's the I'll call it network hygiene that needs to go into place, right? Having multiple resiliency domains, as I like to call it. Being able to have your data segregated or segmented properly with the proper access controls in order to make sure that the bad actors can't get at that data, right? It's one thing to have immutability, but if you're using the same account for accessing those repositories as you are for everything else, you're still going to be vulnerable. It's about making sure that those different layers are individually protected, and being able to have I hate to say it, but a real air gap in the various copies of your data. And the reason that I hate that is that there's a lot of folks out there who are talking about virtual air gaps, and that's just another way to talk about access control rules. And again, if you're not using proper network hygiene, you're gonna have problems. Now, the other thing that goes along with that hygiene and those resiliency domains is the ability to see what's going on. Now, it's outside the scope of our research, but there are organizations out there that do malware detection professionally, and their research teams have talked about bad actors coming in and not just deleting the backup repositories, but playing the long game and changing the backups themselves, changing the backup job so that the job still runs. The same amount of data exists, but it's not the data that you think it is. And so having the ability to see what's going on will give you that visibility that you need into that piece of the attack. And that's key when you're talking about something that is as targeted as what we're seeing with ransomware these days.
Yeah, there's a couple different kinds of monitoring that really start falling into best practice. For one thing, for years, many organizations, the biggest single reason why they were not able to recover, even before ransomware, by the way, was because the IT team wasn't backing up that node. Right? Somebody spun something up in production. No one else knew about it until the original owner came over to IT and said, hey, can you restore data from server X? And the IT team said, what server X? Right? Now, that was prevalent when you could run a Windows server underneath your desk. It was prevalent when you could run a couple of VMs and a little host over in the closet someplace. It's prevalent when you stand up something in M365 or in Amazon or Azure hosting, right? So certainly the idea of monitoring has been part of the backup paradigm as a best practice for quite a while, so that when new production resources come online, there is a sense of discovery, so that those machines can be assured to at least have some level of backup. But you're absolutely right. One of the more mature attack principles these days is to let the backup job continue to run, but progressively maybe reduce, take production servers out of the job, so the job still shows good, it's just not backing up as much. Or in other cases, one of the things that Veeam has been doing for the last couple of years is we monitor things like, let's say, for example, on average, you have a 3% daily churn rate of your data. And then one day, even though you didn't add any new production servers, your backup is 40% bigger than it was yesterday. Might be because all your data is now encrypted, right? So there are things that you can certainly do in the heuristics of the backup behavior that also should be part of that's not what you should be relying on for monitoring, but certainly part of that belt and suspenders approach for that along the way. So monitoring certainly is a big part of that. We also already talked about orchestration as well. But let's talk about that last area, Chris. So we've talked about we have to ensure that we're doing backups, and in fact, we talked about immutability. One of the other statistics you should download from the report is today 4 out of 5 organizations are leveraging at least one cloud service that has an immutable capability, and 2 out of 3 organizations are using an immutability or otherwise impermeable on-prem disk-based solution. So I love the fact that for many organizations, the best practice ought to be when it goes to disk, it should be immutable disk. When it goes to cloud, it should be an immutable cloud. When it goes to tape, it should be an air-gappable tape. There's no reason why that entire data protection multi-tiered lifecycle shouldn't be persistently survivable all the way through that ecosystem along the way. But I know you've got a few more things you want us to discuss as well.
Absolutely, and the one in particular that I wanted to chat about is what's happening during the restore process. So we've got our data. I thought this was interesting because we talk about staged restores and being able to have clean data coming back into your environment. And it's nice to see that we have 44% of respondents saying that they are first putting their data into a sandbox or a testing area before they put it into production. So there's some good news here and some very good best practices that are being highlighted out of this report. Because
I love the
last thing that we want to do is have somebody get reinfected.
Yeah. So the physicians have this motto of first and foremost, do no harm, right? Don't make things worse along the way. And so 44% believe that they are doing some kind of a restore into an isolated or test area, and then before putting it back into production. The inverse of that, unfortunately, means 56% of organizations are not. They're restoring directly back in the production environments, and then they're either monitoring, they're scanning, they're testing, or they're hoping. And that is the degrees of orange and red that you see on that screen. This seems like it would be an obvious kind of thing, except for one ugly truth, and that is it's hard. Right? Not only is it hard to actually do this kind of isolation, by the way, it's the same kind of plumbing that you would need for doing DR testing, which we talked about earlier, is not a trivial effort. But the idea of, okay, I'm going to stand up a sandbox, I'm going to drop my data into there, and then I'm going to run I'm going to run detection against that, and then if it's clean, I'll then either restore it from the sandbox back to production, or I'm going to restore from the recovery medium back into production. Or if it's not clean, I got to step back to the last a version earlier and try that again. Meanwhile, I got the entire senior leadership team breathing down my neck on how fast can we get back up and going again, and I'm going to be tempted to cut some corners, right? So the green wedge, 44% is great, but the reason that most everyone doesn't do it is because it is hard. And so without orchestration, without workflows, without a sandboxing mechanism, without the ability to automate scanning in the recovery stream, so that you can automate the scan, put in some work stream that says, okay, if it's clean, continue with the restoration effort. If it's not clean, step back. What's the next version earlier? Recover from there. That is not a trivial exercise, unless you're using Veeam, but that's not what we're talking about today. But it is the right answer. It's just not trivial. But I love the fact that we are seeing year over year an increase in this. Still, on this particular question, more than half of respondents got it wrong. And in fact, there was one thing that you should be taking away as homework. I guess there should be more than one, but when you're asking your peers, how do we ensure against reinfection? How do we ensure immutability? There's probably a couple others, but those are probably the two biggest ones that I would take away as homework.
Yep, absolutely. And the other question is, where are you going to restore to? Because some days you're not going to have anything left to restore to, right? Your tornado analogy earlier is a great example of that. Same thing is true in the cyber world. The number of stories of organizations who had law enforcement come in and cordon things off and say, no, you can't touch this because we have to deal with chain of custody is pretty amazing, and it stops people dead in their tracks.
Yeah, there's an assumption by a lot of organizations that kind of like, hey, if I've got bad data on my laptop, it's a cruddy day, but I'm going to wipe my laptop down to the hard drive. I will reinstall the OS, and it'll just be an unpleasant day. And some people think that's what they're going to do for the servers. Hey, the server's infected. I will wipe it down to bare metal. Hey, break the drive encryption key. Everything's going to be wiped. It'll be great. It'll be fast. I'll start restoring. And then for all kinds of things. Now, certainly some cases, malware is actually affecting the BIOS, and those servers are bricked. They're unusable. In other cases, as you mentioned, depending on your industry, you might come in and find yellow tape around those racks. You don't have access to that. And even the idea of actually having secondary infrastructure or maybe one of the other data centers, depending on how persistent and how they got in, they could have shredded those servers the same as shredding the original production servers. Metal is metal, and if it's connected, why not? So, and so just like, we'll use the tornado analogy again. Okay, if I lost the primary data center, the secondary data center, if it could be just a couple cities away, which is great because then the same staff can be involved, but oh, by the way, the same tornado could get that too, right? And so for all these kind of disasters, one of the questions you ought to be asking is, where could you or should you recover to? And so what you're looking at here is organizations were asked, when recovering, where do you recover to? Now, the question is slightly abbreviated, and they were given multiple options on here. I do think it's really interesting. The top two options are cloudy. The three green options are on-prem. We did, because again, this is a global survey. So one of the things we wanted to look at was, is there different kinds of biases or behaviors on disaster recovery sites when we go across geographies? One of the things I thought was really interesting is I live in Texas, so my friend south of the border in LATAM, were actually the region or the respondents that were most likely to have a hybrid DR strategy, meaning that they had the option of, hey, if I have metal, I could recover to the metal, or if I want to recover to cloud, I can recover to cloud. I thought that was super interesting. Those folks north of that border in North America were the ones most likely to presume physical hardware, either the original or new hardware. And Chris, I honestly think the North Americans got it wrong, because with the current IT supply chain issues, even if you had a contract that says, no, we're going to drop a whole bunch of new servers into wherever you want them, I would not count on that in my DR plan, but that's just me.
I couldn't agree more. And you know, it's one of those, I call it a knucklehead thing, right? It's small, but so important that being able to have data mobility, right? Being able to recover out to cloudy hardware is vital to survivability. And what's frightening is that there's a lot of organizations out there that if they lose that, even the backup server, right, and the index and the database and all that stuff, you actually lose access to recovery. Suddenly you don't have the ability to access the data,
right?
Even though you could be holding the tape or the drive in your hand. And that's something that's truly frustrating. But you know, the takeaway here is making sure that you've got options. There are so many organizations out there that say, if you just do it my way, if you just buy my box, right? This has been a problem in IT for decades. If you just buy my box, all your problems will be solved. There's this premise that choice is bad, and frankly, I disagree. Having the ability to choose your recovery options, choose your backup options, choose the location, the hardware, the speed for your RPOs and your RTOs is going to be what helps you survive the attacks.
Could not agree more. So when we talk about, disaster recovery as a concept, think about data protection as an umbrella term, right? So backups are one way of making previous versions so that I can recover. Benefit is they typically have the longest life, but the least frequency. You can combine that with replicas, which is actually the mainstay of most BCDR, disaster recovery resiliency type strategies, because the data is near current. But that also means, by the way, if you have corruption or encryption, that is also replicated in near real time. Snapshots, fastest means of recovery, right? Just change the block pointers and you're good to go. But it's within the same instance and locality as the production data. So if you shred the repository, you lose not only the current instance, you lose all the previous snaps as well. So there's not a perfect behavior or mechanic. The trick is to understand that there are reasons why you will need to recover from each of those scenarios, where each of those kinds of data protection are likely to give you the best outcome. So what you want to do is make sure that you're managing those holistically, with a single set of control planes, management planes, and indexes, and then recover using the best iteration of the data for what it's for. But absolutely, control plane and consistency of strategy trumps any given feature, and bless your heart if you think you're just going to get that by buying a box.
Absolutely. And really the main takeaway here is from all the research that you guys have done, Jason, is it's not about just doing one thing. Nope. Right? You need to have multiple capabilities. You need to be looking at the problem holistically, so that you've got those abilities to recover quickly and with clean data. And so if you're looking to learn more for the ransomware trends report, you can use this QR code, or you can use that shortened URL. And you can download the full report and get access to the full set of statistics. And with that, Jason, I want to thank you again for joining us today. And it's always great talking to you. It's always a fun time. And for everybody listening, I want to thank you for joining us and wish you a good day.
Bye, y'all.
All right. Thank you so much, Jason and Chris. Really excellent discussion. Wow. I learned a lot. I know the audience did as well. I want to remind everyone before I announce the winner of our Amazon gift card, check out the handouts tab right there. There's the link on the top to the 2023 Ransomware Trends Report. It's there that you can download just a ton of resources related to the discussion today. Also, check out the Ransomware Prevention Kit. It's an excellent kit for anyone out there who wants to prevent ransomware. And I mean, face it, we all do. So with that in mind, it's now time to announce the winner of our Amazon $250 gift card. This is going to James Stiles from California. Congratulations to James Stiles. We'll be reaching out to you, and we'll also be reaching out to our best question prize winner as well. Thank you to everyone who asks all the great questions on the event today. And with that, of course, big thank you to Veeam for supporting this event and making it possible. Visit veeam.com for more information. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.